Good afternoon. Welcome to the English Speaking Union Happy Hour. Today's presentation is Churchill, mobilizing the English language and sending it into battle, with our guest speaker, Alan Packwood. My name is Barbara Hughes, and I'm a member of the Happy Hour Committee, as well as serving as a national board member. I would particularly like to thank the Happy Hour Committee, which is sponsoring today's Happy Hour. Ideas for our Happy Hour lectures come from our ESU members and viewers as yourselves. At the end of this program, you will receive a survey in your email where you are encouraged to share your feedback about today's lecture. And you're also welcome to suggest ideas for future upcoming Happy Hour presentations. Some other notes about today's presentation. We will have a question and answer at the end of Alan's presentation. You may submit your questions using the dedicated Q&A module at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You may submit questions at any point during the presentation. However, do note the questions will be answered in the order that they are received. I am so very pleased to share that we have over 250 people registered today for our Happy Hour program. And I'd like to share the names of the branches with the most registered people today. They are Central Florida, Greenwich, and New Orleans. And finally, I would like to introduce Dr. Karen Blair Brand, Chairman of the Happy Hour Committee. She has the honor to introduce our guest speaker, Alan Packwood, to you. Karen.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. We're in for a treat and a delight today. I would like to give you a little information on Alan Packwood's background. Alan is the Fellow of the Churchill College at the University of Cambridge. He's the Director of the Churchill Archives, and he's over the management and all the collections. He is also a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. He was awarded the OBE in 2016 at the Queen's Birthday Honors. Alan is well published, and he has given many presentations. He was the keynote speaker for the ESU Annual General Meeting, ESU USA Annual General Meeting in Washington, D.C. in 2019. And Alan, I thank you on behalf of the ESU and the Happy Hour Committee for just your presentation today. Now onward to Alan Packwood's program. Thank you.
Okay, well, Karen, thank you very much for those kind words of introduction, and a huge thank you to Barbara and to the committee for inviting me today. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're dialing in from. I don't think Churchill would have minded which hour was happy hour. After all, this is the man who famously said that he'd taken more out of alcohol than alcohol had taken out of him. Although, of course, stories about his drinking may be slightly exaggerated, not least by Churchill himself. What I'm going to do now is to share my screen with you. There we go. And I thought, just to start, before I get into the meat of my presentation, what I would like to do is just to give you a little bit of context about the Churchill Archives Centre, where I'm based, what we are, what we hold, and what we do with it. So the Churchill Archives Centre, as many of you will know, is based in the grounds of Churchill College, Cambridge. And Winston Churchill played a role in the foundation of the college. He chaired the trust which raised the money, and he came to the Churchill College site just once, on the 17th of October, 1959, just short of his 85th birthday. He came and he planted 2 trees, an oak and a mulberry, and I'm delighted to say that they are both still standing and both still thriving. He came, he planted the trees, and he gave what was one of his last public speeches, in which he set out the vision for the college that was going to bear his name. And that vision, interestingly, was that the college should train, in particular, scientists, technologists, and engineers, which it continues to do to this day. 70% of the fellows and students are engaged in those subjects. And I think it shows him at the end of this long life and career, still looking to the future. It was also, of course, a response to the fact that the Russians had just put Sputnik into space. The Archive Centre comes a little bit later. We were built once it was known that Churchill's papers were going to come to the college. That was after his death and after the death of his son Randolph in 1968. In fact, the Archive Centre was built in 1973, which means we celebrate our 50th anniversary this year. And what I would particularly like to point out in front of this audience is that the Archive Centre was built largely with American money. I think that's partly because there wasn't a great deal of money floating around in Britain in 1973, but it's also because the Archive Centre was going to be the closest thing in the UK to one of your great presidential libraries. So it was a model that your countrymen understood. And the appeal particularly targeted former American ambassadors to the United Kingdom or their families and foundations. And it gives us an impressive list of founding fathers. And I'm sure you'll recognize many of the names there, and many of those names, of course, also, I'm sure, associated with the English-speaking Union. The mission of the Archive Centre is a simple one. It's to preserve the material in our care so that it's here not just for now and for this generation, but for generations to come. We have a conservation workshop on site, a paper conservator, in fact, 2 paper conservators now on our staff, and we have state-of-the-art strong rooms in which we store the papers. I hope in due course some of you will be able to come to Cambridge and we'll be able to show you the facilities. And of course, we make the material available in our reading rooms, which are open to anyone who wants to come and do research. We also lend material to exhibitions, and increasingly, of course, we supply material remotely, digitally. What do we have? Well, of course, we're most famous for holding the papers of Sir Winston Churchill. Won't surprise anyone on this call to know that that is an enormous collection, some 2,500 boxes, an estimated 1 million items covering the whole of Churchill's career, and including the odd cigar. In fact, we have 2 unsmoked Churchill cigars. We're also, I think, now quite well known for housing the papers of Margaret Thatcher, including 1 genuine prime ministerial handbag. But in fact, the Archive Centre is much more than that. Over the years, we've gathered around Churchill the papers of his contemporaries and his successors, and we've become one of the biggest repositories in the United Kingdom for modern personal papers. I won't test an American audience by getting you to identify all of these British figures, but our collections include the papers of Rosalind Franklin, the scientist whose research influenced the discovery of the double helical structure of DNA. We have the papers of Ernest Bevin, Winston Churchill's Minister for Labour during the Second World War, and then Clement Attlee's Foreign Secretary. We have the papers of Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, who went both ways across the Channel during the Second World War, coordinating both the Dunkirk evacuation and then Operation Neptune, the naval aspects of the D-Day landings. And we have the papers of Field Marshal Lord Slim, who commanded British armies in Burma. In fact, we have some 570 collections, so that you can see the real strength of the Archive Centre lies in the body of material that has been assembled under one roof for researchers. But today I'm going to talk about one collection in particular, the Churchill papers, and I'm going to talk about one aspect of Churchill in particular, and that is, of course, his oratory, although I'm quite nervous about speaking to an English-speaking union audience about oratory. And I'm sure that there are many experts in public speaking on this call. So Churchill, the roaring lion. President Kennedy, on awarding Churchill honorary US citizenship in 1963, evoked the words of the American wartime broadcaster Edward R. Murrow, Murrow possibly having got them from the British playwright Beverley Nichols, and claimed that Churchill had mobilized the English language and sent it into battle. And when we talk about the power of Churchill's words, though, I think it's important to make clear that they go beyond his oratory and his speeches. In 1953, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he was awarded it for his contribution to both the spoken and the written word. And during his lifetime, of course, he published some 40 books in some 70 volumes. According to the historian and my predecessor at the Archives Centre, Piers Brendan, when Clement Attlee was asked exactly what Churchill had done to win the war, he would reply, "Talk about it." And Attlee's own experience was that Churchill talked about it constantly in public and in private. And of course, he also wrote about it, both at the time and afterwards. So I want to look today at how Churchill used words in the Second World War in different ways for different audiences and for different purposes. How he used words in public, words as management tools, words in private, and words as part of his legacy. But let's start with his most public words, his speeches and famous broadcasts, and just consider how many phrases from those wartime speeches you already know without really thinking about it. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. This was their finest hour. Give us the tools and we will finish the job. And I could go on. So where did this oratory come from? Well, in part, I think it was in the genes. These are his parents, Lord Randolph Churchill and Lady Randolph Churchill, born Jenny Jerome in Brooklyn, New York. His mother was friendly with George Bernard Shaw. She wrote plays and she edited a short-lived transatlantic journal called the Anglo-Saxon Review. His father, of course, was a Conservative politician rising to become Secretary of State for India and Chancellor of the Exchequer in the mid-1880s, and someone who himself was known for his cutting speeches. So on both sides, I think there is a literary and an oratorical inheritance. But of course, Churchill himself, as a boy, also had clearly an incredibly good memory, but also a voracious appetite for literature. He won a headmaster's recitation competition at Harrow School, and he credited his ability with English to the fact that he'd been thought too stupid to do Latin and Greek, so consequently spent more time in the lower form studying and mastering English. He certainly wasn't a model student. We have his school reports from his first school, St. George's School in Ascot. One notes that he lacks ambition. Another points out that he can't be trusted to behave himself anywhere. But yeah, I think if you read between the lines on these reports, you can see that the ability is there, but latent. He's always good at subjects he's interested in, like English and history. And he later, of course, said that where his reason, interest, or imagination were not engaged, he would not or he could not learn. But he always enjoyed reading. And he later wrote an essay called Hobbies, in which he said that the most common form of diversion is reading. In that vast and varied field, millions find their mental comfort. Nothing makes a man more reverent than a library. as you browse about, taking down book after book from the shelves and contemplating the vast, infinitely varied store of knowledge and wisdom which the human race has accumulated and preserved, pride, even in its most innocent forms, is chased from the heart by feelings of awe, not untinged with sadness. What shall I do with all my books, was the question, and the answer, read them, sobered the questioner. But if you cannot read them, at any rate handle them, and as it were, fondle them, peer into them, let them fall open where they will. Read on from the first sentence that arrests the eye, then turn to another. Make a voyage of discovery, taking soundings of enchanted seas. Well, I think you can see in those passages Churchill's own mastery of words, but I think his passion for reading also comes across. Of course, he didn't go to university and was largely self-educated. It was when he was in his 20s and in the army that he embraced both reading and writing. Transferred to garrison duty in Bangalore with his regiment, the 4th Hussars, in India in 1895, he decided that he wanted to take up his late father's mantle and that he wanted to go into politics. And that meant mastering history, philosophy, and economics. And it also meant, of course, securing both a name and an income for himself. To get into Parliament, he needed fame and fortune to get elected and to fund his political career. And he realized that he could acquire both through his pen. And so he became, as a young man in his 20s, a war correspondent, writing up his military adventures as newspaper articles and then as books. He was prolific, and he very quickly developed a mastery of words. But of course, it may seem strange to us now, but of course, he also had to overcome a shyness about public speaking and also a speech impediment, one that meant that he could not properly say the letter S. And to overcome these, he approached the whole question of public speaking very seriously, very professionally, and at just the age of 22, while in India, he researched and wrote an article called The Scaffolding of Rhetoric, one of the few articles that he wrote during his lifetime, which he chose not to publish, but which does set out his views on oratory, and I think shows him thinking seriously about how to become a public speaker. And of course, in addition to self-education, drive, and research, he also very quickly, and certainly by the time of the Second World War, had developed an enormous amount of experience in public speaking. His oratory was formed in the Edwardian age, forged in electoral contests in a pre-radio time when the speaker had to address mass audiences without electronic amplification. By the time Churchill became Prime Minister in 1940, age 65, he had 40 years of experience in making speeches inside and outside the House of Commons. First elected to Parliament in 1900, and of course, serving in the British cabinet from 1908 at the age of 33. But even so, and even when you get to the Second World War, you still find that he prepares extremely carefully. So how did Churchill approach and construct his speeches? Well, the way that he worked is that he would dictate. There would be a duty secretary on call with a state-of-the-art silent typewriter. And she, because they largely were female, would then take down his words and set them out on the page in normal typescript, as you see here. And Churchill would then go through making corrections, annotations, and changes. And of course, it's great to look at these because when you study these, they give you a wonderful insight into Churchill's mindset and into the way he is approaching his craft. You can see the changes he's making and you can guess at the reasons. Is it to improve the sound of the speech? Is it because he's realized he's got something wrong? Is it because of a new piece of information that's just come in? And the speech might go through several drafts like this. But when it's more or less complete, it will be taken away by the duty secretary and it will be retyped to the size that fits comfortably into his hand or into his coat pocket, and retyped on the page in this blank verse format like poetry, which is something I think that is fairly unique to Churchill. But when you see it on the page like this, you can immediately see why he does it, because having the speech set out like this gives him the rhythm. It gives him the pauses. It gives him the emphasis. And you're looking here at the final page of his finest hour speech, delivered on the 18th of June, 1940, delivered in the House of Commons and then broadcast over the BBC. The previous page has ended what General Weygand calls the Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. And then you have this wonderful, almost Shakespearean ending. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization, building up at the end to let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and Commonwealth lasts for 1,000 years, men will still say this was their finest hour. But even here, you can see last minute changes and corrections. Churchill is working and reworking the speech right up until the point of delivery. And my point here is that although we think of him quite rightly as a famous orator, actually in many ways, he is first and foremost a writer. And he's certainly not a natural orator, perhaps in the way of Lloyd George or his friend F.E. Smith. He's someone who always prepares his speeches extremely carefully. And there is a wonderful passage in the memoir of one of his secretaries, Elizabeth Nell, which I think captures that creative process. And let me just read that to you. So she writes, on these occasions, he would walk up and down the room, his forehead crinkled in thought, the cords of his dressing gown trailing behind him. He often wore his favourite red, green and gold dressing gown when dictating. Sometimes he would fling himself for a moment into a chair. Sometimes he would pause to light his cigar, which with so much concentration was neglected and frequently went out. For minutes, he might walk up and down, trying out sentences to himself. Sometimes his voice would become thick with emotion, and occasionally a tear would run down his cheek. So you can see the effort and the preparation going into these speeches, but what makes them so effective? Well, let's go back to that essay I mentioned a moment ago, Scaffolding of Rhetoric, written at the age of 22, in which Churchill seeks to analyse what makes for a powerful speech. And when you revisit this essay, it almost seems like a personal manifesto for Churchill. It starts with the words, of all the talents bestowed upon men, none is so precious as the gift of oratory. And interesting, of course, because when he wrote those words, he was yet to master oratory. At this point, he'd only given one serious political speech, and that had been to the Conservative Primrose League organisation at Claverton Manor in Bath. But he was thinking seriously about how he was going to develop this skill. And he identifies a number of elements that he sees as important. And when you look, I think, at his speeches in the Second World War, you can see that those elements are there. First one is authenticity. He writes that every orator means what he says at the moment he says it. And I think listening to Churchill's wartime speeches, no one could doubt Churchill's conviction to his message of fighting on in 1940. He's consistent in that main message in private as well as in public. Also, of course, the voice is clearly his own. He doesn't use script writers. And many of the words that he uses were actually already quite archaic by 1940. He uses the language of his youth and of his education, so that he will talk in terms of the old and new worlds. He'll talk about defending halves with martial vigor. It makes for a very distinctive and immediately recognizable voice. Then one of the other skills, I think, is correctness of diction. At key moments in these speeches, he quite deliberately uses very short words. Just think about blood, toil, tears, and sweat. This was their finest hour. Give us the tools. And the advantage, I think, of using those short words is that it makes for a very direct impact. There's no complexity, there's no ambiguity. He also utilizes rhythm enhanced by repetition and alliteration. So, for example, speaking of a new dark age made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. That's from his speech of the 18th of June. Look at the alliteration on perhaps protracted and perverted. Or from his speech of the 20th of August, 1940, when he's talking about Anglo-American relations and comparing them to the mighty Mississippi River, he says, let it roll on full flood, inexorable, irresistible, benignant, to broader lands and better days. Again, repetition, alliteration, and rhythm. He's also a master of analogy and metaphor. And the perorations of his speeches, of course, bring all of these elements together. So think of his speech of the 4th of June, 1940. We shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. But there are also, of course, other elements of his oratory that draw on his experience, that draw on his brilliant memory, that draw on his knowledge of literature, his knowledge of poetry and Shakespeare, and on the language of the Bible, a particular British literary tradition that would have been instantly recognizable to the education sections of his domestic audience. So his broadcast of the 19th of May, 1940, his first broadcast as Prime Minister, ends with a biblical quotation taken from 1 Maccabees 3:58-60. Arm yourselves and be ye men of valor, and be in readiness for the conflict. And as we've already seen, the final passage of his finest hour speech of the 18th of June, 1940, has deliberate echoes of Shakespeare and of Henry V. And actually in these speeches, he will regularly quote poetry and quote literature. He'll also use British history. His speech of the 11th of September 1940 in response to the developing Blitz contains his response to the threat of invasion, comparing the week when the Spanish Armada was approaching the Channel and Drake was finishing his game of bowls, or when Nelson stood between us and Napoleon's grand army at Boulogne. We've read all about this in the history books, but what is happening now is on a far greater scale and of far more consequence to the life and future of the world and its civilization than these brave old days of the past. So using literature, using history. So these then, I think, are the factors that come together to make his speeches so effective. But what role did those speeches play? Well, I think one of the roles, of course, is that they allow him to strengthen his own position in 1950 by appealing to an audience beyond Westminster. We have to remember that Churchill was not elected Prime Minister in May 1940. He was there because of a Westminster coup. He was there because the Labour Party would not serve in a coalition government, a national government, under Neville Chamberlain. So a new government needs to be formed. The Conservatives are the largest party. It will need to be led by a Conservative. That narrows the choice to Churchill and Halifax. Halifax, of course, rules himself out, and I think the mood of the House of Commons is at that point pro-Churchill, because they want someone who's going to take the fight to the enemy. It's a choice between a dove and a hawk, and they want the hawk. But Churchill's political position is not particularly strong. He doesn't have a large faction of his own within Parliament. There are many members of the Conservative Party who remain loyal to Chamberlain at this point. And when Churchill constructs his war cabinet, which he has to do very quickly, he has no choice but to bring in his predecessor, Neville Chamberlain, his main rival, Lord Halifax, and the two leaders, Clement Attlee and Arthur Greenwood of the Labour Party, a party that he's spent much of the last 10 years attacking. So that when he looks around that cabinet table, it is not a group of his own choosing, and it's not necessarily a group of natural allies. So he needs to bolster his position. And one way he can do that is through his oratory in Parliament and through his broadcasts to the nation. But his broadcasts are also aimed at a wider audience. In fact, they're aimed at multiple audiences. They're designed to send a message of hope to occupied Europe, a message of defiance to the Axis powers, but also, of course, a clear call for support to the United States. And if you listen to all of his major speeches from the spring, summer of 1940, they all contain appeals to Washington, DC. And his speeches, of course, also have a clear value as wartime propaganda, as these posters illustrate. Even those speeches that were not broadcast were heavily reported. And this helps, I think, identify Churchill with the British war effort. He comes to personify it. This is leadership from the front. And of course, that means that since 1940, these speeches have become part of a national narrative and a national mythology. But lest we get carried away, like all aspects of Churchill's war leadership, I think there is need for nuance when discussing his oratory. Not all of his speeches are remembered. Some of the speeches he gave at the time are now largely forgotten. It's noticeable that his speech of the 4th of July, 1940, about the destruction of the French fleet is now very rarely cited, almost certainly because that action does not fit with that central narrative of Britain standing alone and stoically facing attack, instead showing an extremely aggressive policy towards a former ally. But at the time, that speech was incredibly important, and it was actually the moment that saw Churchill receive his first standing ovation as Prime Minister in the House of Commons. And you could make a similar argument for his address on the death of Chamberlain in November 1940, a brilliant oration in which Churchill praises his predecessor. It's also true, of course, that the speeches were not universally well received by everyone, but that was never going to be the case, and I think they did capture the spirit of the moment. But it's noticeable that Churchill fails to adapt his style as the war continues, and that while his speeches of 1940 to 42 are remembered, and they're remembered as speeches from a period of national struggle when the outcome was still uncertain, his later speeches, those from 43 to 45, have been much less focused on. I think, that's inevitably because his style remained the same and people grew tired of it as they grew more war weary. It's also true, of course, that his own health was declining, and that later in the war he struggled to rise to the great occasions. But I think it's also because the drama of those later speeches no longer matched the drama of the moment, because the war was no longer simply about survival. It was much more difficult for Churchill to rally the nation around fighting in the Middle East. The range of issues was multiplying, and as they do so, you start to get a multiplicity of views. By late 1944, he's walking a tightrope in his parliamentary speeches as he tries to keep his coalition together. The Labour Party are solidly against his support for the nationalist forces fighting the communists in Greece, while the Conservative Party are opposing his appeasement of Stalin in Poland. And you can sense his exasperation in the quote I use at the conclusion of my book, How Churchill Waged War. Speaking in Parliament in the aftermath of the Yalta Conference in February 1945, he said, "In 1940 to 41, when we in this island were all alone and invasion was so near, the actual steps we ought to take seemed plain and simple. If a man is coming across the sea to kill you, you do everything in your power to make sure that he dies before he finishes his journey. That may be difficult and painful, but it is at least simple. Now we enter into a world of imponderables, and at every stage, occasions for self-questioning arise. It is a mistake to look too far ahead. Only one link in the chain of destiny can be handled at a time." And I think by the time you get to 1944 or 45, there's no longer that national unity imposed by the threat of invasion and defeat. And as party politics return and thoughts turn to reconstruction, Churchill's language can seem out of touch, archaic, dwelling on the past. And whereas in 1940, that had identified him with a historical tradition and continuity, something that people needed to hear, that same language now identifies with him with a return to pre-war values. And by 1945, that's not what many of the British electorate wanted. It contrasted with a well-articulated progressive Labour vision for the future. Churchill failed to appreciate that, and he made some spectacular missteps, most notably in his election broadcast of the 4th of June, 1945, where he warned that the Labour Party might have to fall back on some form of Gestapo. Now, of course, he was talking about people who until only a few weeks before had been serving in his government. Those later speeches, I think, are also forgotten now because they do not form part of that national narrative of fighting on in 1940. Churchill has become the voice of 1940, but not the voice of 1944 and of D-Day. It's very interesting that the popular narrative for D-Day has tended to focus on the American infantrymen. So 1940 is Churchill and Darkest Hour, 1944 is Saving Private Ryan. So that's the speeches. But of course, communication was central to Churchill's war premiership in private as well as in public. He created a well-oiled secretariat at the heart of the Whitehall machine that could channel information and instructions to both the civil service and the military around the clock. And you get a sense of that, I think, when you visit his Churchill war rooms in London. He was a dictator only in the sense that he dictated a constant flow of minutes and telegrams to his personal secretaries. He established early on that he expected his colleagues and his subordinates to communicate with him in writing and in clear, concise English. And this minimized the time that he needed to spend in meetings and private conversations, and it allowed him to choose the issues he wished to focus on at any given time. Clementine Churchill advised Edward Spears, the liaison officer between Churchill and de Gaulle, that writing was the best way of getting her husband's attention. He often does not listen or does not hear if he's thinking of something else, but he will always consider a paper carefully and take in all its implications. He never forgets what he has seen in writing. And that, of course, was advice that she took herself in June 1940 when she had to write her husband a particularly difficult letter, telling him that there was a risk of him being seen as too rough, sarcastic, and overbearing. And Churchill's obsession with brevity even formed the subject of this prime ministerial directive to the War Cabinet, written at the height of the Battle of Britain, in which he expressed his loathing of tortuous constructions like consideration should be given to the possibility of carrying into effect. And he rejected officialese jargon in favor of setting out the real points concisely. So his government really was to be accompanied by a change in tone. And similarly, he insisted that all his requests for action should be given in writing by his staff as minutes, so that his wishes were clear and could not be misunderstood, and to prevent anyone acting on the assumption or rumour of what he might have wanted. And if they were particularly urgent, he would affix a small red label stating action this day. There were actually two other gradings: report within 3 days and report as soon as possible. And it's very telling, I think, that those later two categories were very rarely used. Not that there was likely to be any mistake or any mistaking a missive from the Prime Minister, as it would be dictated in his own highly personalised, grandiloquent style and distinctive voice. Many of his inner circle later recorded their own favourite examples of Churchillian language. Lawrence Burgess, an Assistant Secretary to the War Cabinet, recalled him commenting when discussing the means of protecting Parliament in session from doodlebugs, "There are too many eggs in the parliamentary basket, and though some of them are addled, it is our duty to preserve them." And when the allocation of cement, which was in desperately short supply, was on the cabinet agenda, he opened the discussion with the words, "Well, it's the same old story, too many little pigs and not enough teats on the old sow." And James Stewart, his chief whip from 1941, recalled him describing the Greek general Plastiras as plaster arse, and expressing the hope that his feet were not made of clay. Of course, Churchill's words could also get him into trouble. The effect of years of pressure, combined with the frustrations of managing political alliances at home and abroad, led to increasing outbursts in meetings against those individuals who Churchill saw as seeking to thwart his policies. These might be the Indian nationalist leader Mohandas Gandhi, the leader of the Free French General de Gaulle, or the Labour Party chairman Harold Lasky. They were all prominent recipients of Churchill's wrath and invective, expressed privately but consistently, and recorded by those around him in their diaries. His remarks about Indians being a beastly people at the time of the Bengal famine have come back to haunt him and are now frequently cited as evidence of his racism. But his outbursts were violent, but often short-lived. And there are many examples of Eden and others delaying telegrams and papers dictated by the Prime Minister in the heat of the moment, before later persuading him to moderate his tone. He was given to showing and expressing his emotions, which I think made him easier to read than either Roosevelt or Stalin, but also easier to understand. So Churchill conducted his war via words written and spoken. And those words were also, of course, kept, forming a working resource that he could refer back to when dealing with recurring issues, but also, of course, forming the basis of the archive that survives to this day. And the creation of that archive allowed him to use words in a different way to shape his legacy. They allowed him to fight the war posthumously. This, after all, is the man who joked in the House of Commons in 1948 that, "For my part, I consider that it will be found much better by all parties to leave the past to history, especially as I propose to write that history myself." And write it he did. His 6-volume history of the Second World War was published around the world between 1948 and 1954, totaling almost 2 million printed words and selling millions of copies. Professor David Reynolds of Christ's College here in Cambridge has analysed Churchill's literary files for this great work in his seminal book, In Command of History, Churchill Fighting and Writing the Second World War. And he's shown how Churchill constructed a narrative that supported both his ongoing reputation and his continuing political ambitions. Churchill's version of events, illustrated with a selection of his own telegrams, continues to influence the modern interpretation. So, what I hope I've shown today in these few words is how Churchill deployed words, both at the time and afterwards, to secure his place in history. He knew their power, but interestingly, he did not want to be judged on words alone. In September 1945, as he flew to Lake Como, the election defeat still raw, he told his doctor, Lord Moran, "People say my speeches after Dunkirk were the thing. That was only a part, not the chief part," he complained. "They forget I made all the main military decisions." And he put it more dramatically on the 30th of November 1954, his 80th birthday, when he told a gathering of parliamentarians in Westminster Hall that it was the people who demonstrated the lion's heart. He'd just been called upon to give the lion's roar, but he also hoped he'd been able to show the lion where to use its claws. And if you'll have me back again, next time, maybe we can debate his actions. But I think I'll leave it there today. Thank you all very much.
We do have a few questions for you. One of the first questions is, have there been computer-assisted word frequency analyses of Churchill's writings, also speeches and books, to determine the dictionary of language that was specific to him?
That's a really great question. And I think the answer is not yet, but I would imagine it's coming very, very soon. Of course, if anyone is interested in Churchill's speeches, there is an 8-volume, I think, definitive edition of his speeches, which was produced by Robert Rhodes James, the Conservative politician in the 1970s. And there have been, of course, various collections of Churchill speeches, some published during his lifetime and some since. And various scholars, of course, have done analysis of those speeches. There is a book by Professor Richard Toy of Exeter University called The Roar of the Lion, which includes a lot of information about Churchill's oratory. And there are certainly books that have focused on how Churchill produced the speeches, and also of the literary allusions that he uses in those speeches. But I'm aware of at least 3 companies who are currently working on applying AI to Churchill in some form or another. So I'm sure it's coming soon. And I think, you know, Churchill would have been interested in this. He was someone who was always interested in the potential of science and technology. This, after all, is the man who said, I think at Harvard in 1943, that the empires of the future are the empires of the mind.
Hey, David, thank you for that question. Robert Franklin has another question for you, Alan. I would like to hear Mr. Packwood's opinion of Andrew Roberts's biography of Churchill.
Okay, well, I mean, it's a very good biography and an extremely well researched biography. And of course, Andrew has been assiduous in sort of tracking down news sources. So he's been able to access material from the Royal Archives in Windsor. He's been able to access new material at the Churchill Archive, including the papers of Mary Soames and Sarah Churchill, Winston Churchill's daughters. We took in material after Mary's death, and we've since been able to make that available. So he certainly made the most of utilising that material. I always say when asked about this that I think, you know, it's interesting to look at the range of different biographies that there are about Churchill. Obviously, you've got the official biography produced started by Randolph Churchill and finished by Martin Gilbert. An incredible work, 8 volumes with 23 companion volumes, which really underpins, you know, an enormous amount of Churchill scholarship. And I think, you know, if you look at Martin Gilbert's approach, it was very much as a chronicler. What he was creating, I think, is a record of exactly what Churchill did when. I think subsequent biographers, of course, have taken different approaches and building on Martin's work, have sought to analyse Churchill in different ways. And I think I always say that you can see a a little bit of the biographer in the final work. So I think it's interesting that Roy Jenkins writes his biography of Churchill, and the Churchill that emerges, I think, is very much the liberal politician. Andrew Roberts writes his biography of Churchill, and the Churchill that emerges is very much the conservative politician. I suspect that if you analysed my work in the same way, you would find that I've taken an archivist's approach to Churchill. But I think the great thing about Churchill is that he's such an amazing career and such a big subject that there is room for all of these different interpretations.
Thank you. Roman asks, can you comment and evaluate the Iron Curtain speech?
And the Iron Curtain speech is an incredibly important speech. We do have the original speaking notes in the Churchill Archives Centre. It's important, I think, both personally and publicly. It's important personally for Churchill because it's the speech that he uses to relaunch himself on the international stage after the 1945 election defeat. He's invited by President Truman, which is why he goes to Fulton, Missouri. He knows he'll be able to spend time with the president on the way. He knows that the president will introduce him, which means that he knows that the world's media will be watching. So this is a personal relaunch. But of course, it's also politically an incredibly important speech because it's the speech in which he sort of breaks with Stalin. We're still nominally allied to the Soviet Union at this stage, but it's the speech where Churchill, of course, famously points out that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent, and that was actually quite a controversial thing to say at the time. Both President Truman in the United States and Clement Attlee in the United Kingdom distanced themselves from Churchill's remarks, and Stalin takes out an editorial in Pravda to condemn those remarks. And some scholars actually trace the origins of the Cold War back to this moment and see it as one of the sort of decisive steps in the development of the Cold War. So, with the benefit of hindsight, with knowing how quickly the Cold War develops, we tend to take that breach for granted. But actually, this was quite a controversial thing for Churchill to say at the time. It also wasn't the only focus of that speech. What he was trying to argue in that speech, which he called the sinews of peace, was that the future peace of the world depended on the continuation of the Anglo-American wartime alliance and cooperation.
Okay, another question, thank you. Is there anything in the Churchill papers regarding the sinking of the HMT Rona?
A very good question, and not one that I immediately know the answer to, but I would be very happy to look. And if you want to email me at the Archive Centre, director.archives@chew.cam.ac.uk, or if you go to the Archive Centre website, you can see the general email there. If whoever's asking that question wants to email it in, we can certainly do a search for them.
Thank you so much. M. Wang asks, why do you think there are not many orators like Churchill anymore?
Well, again, a really good question. And I suppose part of the answer is that you have to see Churchill's oratory within the context of the time and the expectations of the time. He was speaking at a time when, of course, speeches like that in Parliament were expected. And he was speaking, as I said, in a radio age, when people would take time to listen to these speeches on the radio. Now, of course, we live in an age of 24-hour news cycles and sound bites and television, and of course now the internet and social media. And I think all of that means that there is a focus on perhaps sound bites rather than longer speeches. That's not to say, of course, that Churchill couldn't have mastered the soundbite. I mean, I think the point I made in my presentation is that he was very aware of key phrases in his speeches, and he was very aware of making them short and to the point. So you can see that phrases like blood, toil, tears, and sweat might actually work quite well today over social media.
Okay, another very quick question and last question is, has the Churchill Archives Centre been fully digitalized?
The short answer to that is no. The Churchill papers have been digitized. This is Winston Churchill's own papers. And we've done that working with a commercial publisher, Bloomsbury. So the people who brought you Harry Potter have reinvested their Harry Potter gains in producing an online edition of the Churchill papers, which they then sell to other research libraries and universities around the world, which in turn then creates an income stream back to the Archive Centre. But we continue to make them freely available at point of delivery in Cambridge. Many of Margaret Thatcher's papers have been digitised, and a selection is freely available through the website of the Margaret Thatcher Foundation. And some of our other collections have been digitised, but there's an enormous amount still to do, an enormous amount of material still to work through. The good news is that the Archive Centre now has its own reprographic suite, and we have the ability to digitise material ourselves now, rather than relying on third-party contractors. And one of the things that we introduced during COVID, and that we've kept since the end of the pandemic, is a free research and copying service. So we will do up to an hour's free research and an hour's free copying per researcher per month. So that those people who can't afford to visit the Archive Centre, or perhaps only want to see one file or a few documents, can email us and we will digitize those on demand for them.
Thank you, Alan, so much. And I would like to thank you for such an enriching program for our English speaking happy hour talk today. And I want to thank the participants for their thoughtful questions. I'm sorry we ran out of time and could not have you answer all of them. So I would now like to turn the program over to the English Speaking Union's Executive Director, Karen Karpowicz, for final remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan. It was enjoyable yet again. I remember my first speech of yours, which you did at our annual general meeting, and you did it on Churchill and his movie, how he was represented in film, which was really fascinating. So this is equally as interesting. I also wanted to mention that our annual general meeting this fall will be in Kansas City. And part of the weekend will be a trip to Fulton, Missouri, and we'll be visiting the American National Churchill Library. And so if all of our Churchill people out there, which are so many, please join us this October 20th in Kansas City if you want to come with us on that tour. Thank you all again. This is always a pleasure for us. And I want to again congratulate the actual happy hour committee for their work and their ideas and their creativity in engaging the speakers and these programs. Thank you again. And our next happy hour is April 26th, when we'll be discussing Rudyard Kipling's Kim. And the speaker is Dave Richards. And I think that's being sponsored by our Greenwich branch. Thank you again and have a lovely evening.